Here, I'll try zooming in. Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, and joining me is the great TolkienLore geek from TolkienLore.
Howdy.
So let's hope someone joins in. Otherwise, this is going to be a little bit of a funny stream.
Well, speaking of funny, I decided to just lay on the irony since, we had that whole problem and change the time of the thing. It's like a wizard is never late, except when daylight savings time ruins things.
Oh yeah, that it just always gets me. Like,
yeah. Well, it wasn't. You mentioned 3 p.m. Eastern time, and I'm like, okay, that's 1 hour east of me, so that's just minus 1 hour. And I wasn't even thinking about the fact that in Canada it's a little bit different than in the U.S. And it's like,
Yeah, same thing happened the other day when because I've been trying to approach publishers with my novel, and I get this meeting with a publisher, and he goes, "No." I said, I think he said like 2 p.m., and I'm like, I end up showing up at the wrong, ready for the wrong time, and I go like an hour early, and I'm going, wait,
where is he?
This clock. Yeah. What can you do?
The sooner they get rid of daylight savings time, the better, and then we can all just be like, okay, we all get it now.
Yeah, I fully agree. Whoever invented daylight savings time was a monster. Of greater proportion than Morgoth. Anyways, to start with, I'm just checking my notes because I need it just for the timeline right now. We're going to be discussing, as the title says, the Children of Hurin, primarily in relation to Turin Turambar, the Master of Doom, who was in turn mastered by Doom, which is such a fitting title for him. But I think that I'm just going to try to supply a bit of background to the story. It's one of the 3 great epics of the First Age, as anyone who's familiar with the Silmarillion knows. But it's probably the darkest, I think, of the 3 great epics, which are Beren and Luthien, Children of Hurin, Fall of Gondolin. And this story, now, long before this story starts, Morgoth steals the pretty rocks that the Noldor really love, runs off to Angband with Feanor and his crew in pursuit. Feanor then kicks the bucket, and the bucket takes him out in the shape of of Gothmog, I think it is, with his whips. And after Feanor's passing, there's in time the Siege of Angband, which you then get at some point afterwards, the Dagor Bracolach, which, and I'm really summarizing here because, well, there's not enough time to go through it all. And if I miss anything, do correct me. I'm prone to missing details. And Dagor Bracolach leads to, I believe, the death of the greatest elf of all times, in my opinion, Fingolfin. And after that, you have Beren, who ends up, there's someone who has a podcast that's over on Instagram, whom I follow. I forget the name of, but how she worded it was, Beren ends up being a homeless guy who ends up stalking a princess, who in turn later, I think, stalks him, and he ends up rescuing her from 2 other stalkers. And so it's a story of stalkings. And
it's kind of true, actually.
But it's the most romantic story. And the person, I think, meant it as, well, when I talked to her, she said that it was, I think, one of her favorite stories. But you have to make light from.
Yeah.
Now, Beren, though, was a distant relative to the House of Hador, I think it is, which is to say the family line which Turin belongs to. And so right here we have the first link between this one lineage and, if indirectly so, to the House of Thingol, which is to say the ruling house of the Sindarin elves over in Doriath, with Thingol probably being another one of my favorite characters. as he's such a fascinating character. And you have Baron who goes off, gets his shiny rock, brings it back to his dad-in-law, and the shiny rock is left to, I guess, sit for a while in Doriath for a while, long after this quest, while Baron and Luthien elope. And this victory over Morgoth, which is kind of a big deal because no one's actually won in any way almost against Morgoth since this whole shindig started. So this kind of convinced Maethros, the, I would argue, best of the Feanorians. There's a reason in French, in the French translation, he's called Le Grand, or the Great. So Maethros gets it in his head, hey, if some hippie and his girlfriend can take Morgoth, maybe we can too, which doesn't really work out. No, I think I said it in my Turin video. Baron's the homeless guy with the hippie girlfriend is how I worded it. But sorry, I love Baron, but you gotta.
Yeah. I mean, point is, it's just two people and a dog.
Yeah. So basically, the greatest story ever told because there's a dog in it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a dog person, so
Don't blame you.
Okay. But this battle that takes place between the League founded by Maethros and Morgoth's forces ends up being something of a disaster. It's a fiasco, as it rallies a lot of heroes together, but ultimately the Easterlings don't prove very loyal and end up tearing apart a good chunk of the Union of Maethros' army. And Morgoth secures a massive victory. And you have Hurin and Huar, who do a lot of great rear guard action until Huar is taken out by an arrow. And Hurin, who is the father of Turin Turambar, ends up fighting and doing a really epic, very, like, no joke, it's a very valorous, incredible moment when he swings the axe 72 times and says, Ale Antaluva, the day shall come again, but he's ultimately captured and dragged before Morgoth, who curses his family. And from there, the possible doom ends up haunting Turin and Nienor and Morwen, and even Hurin to an extent, for the rest of their lives. Now, I only say possible doom only because while there is certainly a doom that seems to be coming into play, there are times when it seems like it's more, as I think Gwyndor put it, it's more Turin's own actions that seem to screw him up and trip him up and face plants in life. And so there's a saying I once heard: we're all responsible for our own actions, and we should have no one else to blame but ourselves for our decisions and our actions. With Turin, this is kind of the case, but there's also the complicated fact that Morgoth may have leveled an actual curse. And I only say, I'm of the mindset that there is a curse, but on the other hand, Turin does not exactly handle it in.
He doesn't help himself.
No.
At all.
Yeah. And the curse eventually leads him to his own doom, where at the end of it all, I just speed up here because I really liked how you put it in one of your videos. Turin puts an end to an already bad run, and before it could get any worse, which I do love that phrase. I'm going to be honest. This is the first story of the Silmarillion I ever read, so it's got a lot of sentimental value to me. But on the other hand, I crack fun to keep from crying because it's such a depressing story.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a rough place to start in the Silmarillion. I mean, if that's the first one you read, then everything was uphill from there.
Yeah. Well, the first story I read was The Hobbit, then Lord of the Rings, then Children of Hurin.
Yeah. I mean, that is like jumping off the cliff into the deepest, darkest parts of Tolkien's imagination.
Yeah. And at the time, I kind of went, holy cow. Like, how do we go from Hobbit to Lord of the Rings to this? And,
Yeah.
well, that's how the cookie crumbles, I guess. Now, along the way, Turin also ends up collecting a lot of names because he's trying to escape this curse, which works in very particular way. It seems like Morgoth needs to know the location and the name, or something. It's very vague, and it seems more like it's influencing rather than having direct power, at least from what I can observe of this read through for the book. But as for the story, Turin does not. We'll go back to the beginning, I think, because this would be a good point to start at the start again, now that we're caught up on the timeline, and go from there. Turin is the son of course, Hurin and Morwen, with Morwen being a mother who she's not in the most maternal sort. And you have some thoughts there.
There are a lot of thoughts.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, you could argue that a lot of what happens to Turin throughout his life is in part Morwen's fault, just because she is so distant and cold, and then she sends him off on his own and doesn't attempt to rejoin him until so much later. Like, it's understandable why she doesn't attempt the journey at the time, because she is pregnant and,
Yeah,
climbing over mountains and going through the woods of Doriath. It's like, that's really not. But then she waits another, what, at least
like
10 years before she even attempts to make it.
yeah,
And, it's just like, if she had been more emotionally connected in the way that Hurin was with Turin, and if she had been a little more proactive about trying to, I mean, you don't want to armchair quarterback a mother's decisions in a really tough time, but it
she could have handled
does.
it better.
Yeah, and it's not even to say that she was doing anything in. She was clearly trying to do the best that she could,
Mm-hmm.
but arguably those decisions were not the best. And even
No,
if they were the best decisions she could make, it is still the case that Turin's psyche is radically shaped by that history. Like, whatever fault you want to lay or not lay at Morwen's feet, like, I mean, that is Turin's childhood, and that's, you cannot get away from taking that as the basis for a lot of what he does later in the story.
yeah, and you throw in the fact that his Lalaeth, I think it is, his sister passes away in his childhood, and he's forbidden from talking about it or from crying in front of her. That would kind of
Yeah.
that's gonna mess you up a little psychologically.
Yeah. Well, and you can see that reflected in most of his later life, where he is very cold and distant himself in a lot of ways. Like,
Yeah,
the one kind of relatable thing about his character is that he is moved by pity.
yeah,
But so often he doesn't show that, except for cases that are very much like Lalaith's. Like, it's always toward a female who's in deep trouble, pretty much. I mean, pretty much everything other than that, he's very aloof, he's very cold, he's very, I mean, just like his temperament is, he's either on fire or he's an iceberg, and that's it.
yeah. Well, yeah, he's a he's he's not exactly like, say, Aragorn,
No.
who is very warm towards people, and actually had a good childhood thanks to Elrond. And so I just compare him to Elrond because I think that's probably the warrior that most people are familiar with. And I say warrior more to just well, that's only one part of Aragorn, but that might be something that an aspect of the character that people might make the comparison. But yeah, Turin to But the thing with Turin, when he does show compassion, is that no good deed ever goes unpunished.
That's true.
So with Mim, wow, does that mess up? Honestly, now I remember I'm a fan of 90s and 80s fantasy. So when I read that part, I just went, wow, okay, this reminds me of Suikoden N1. I don't know if you know the game, but like it's a Japanese game, and it's just like where the character is operating under a curse, and everything he does will screw him up in the end. And it's just wow, so no good deed ever goes unpunished. Okay, I see where that game drew inspiration, because it was inspired by Children of Hurin, and it's like, oh, okay, I see where the inspiration is coming from. I'm just going to say a quick hello to Epic Kingdom, because, well, he's a fellow YouTuber. He's a great guy. I think you're probably more acquainted with him to an extent than I am, only because I've not spent as much time lately on the Tolkien Discord, private Discord, because life. Sorry. But that said, okay, so it's Erwin. I just checked my notes. Erwin Lalaeth, but Lalaeth is laughter. So
right,
Turin, though,
nickname.
Yeah. Turin, though, seems to long after he's sent there. Not long after he's sent there, he's fostered by Thingol. So Thingol takes up the role of father figure of a sort to Turin. But so does Baelig, who's the guy who kind of finds Turin as he's getting lost with his servants in the forest of Doriath. And you've got Turin, who not really knowing anyone in Doriath outside, because, I think he's been separated from his father, who, as far as they know, might have died in near Nyaf Arnodiad, which that would also mess him up, because Hurin was the warmer parent. He's separated from his mother, Sador Labadel, whom was a bit of a he was more like a best friend, but I'm going to say kind of an uncle-like figure. Kind of, yeah. He was a servant. And so Baelig, I think, is the first person to show him this human compassion, which Turin is in dire need of after everything that's happened in Dorloman and in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. So you've got Turin, who's kind of on an emotional level an orphan, and Baelig, I guess, is the guy who kind of takes him in. Though Thingol, I think I'm actually going to go off on a limb and say I don't think enough people stress that relationship, because I'm just looking at it from Norse history and mythology. The act of being a foster parent to someone in Nordic society was a big deal. You're essentially adopting this person, this kid. And it meant in a lot of Norse sagas, you have characters who act like actual parents and hold up these foster kids almost on a par with their own children. So it's a very, very important bond. And so I think if we look at the bond, Thingol doing this with Turin, this is very important. Now, I don't think it puts Turin in line for the front of Doriath, Lord no, but it does, however, signal a very important role for Turin within Doriath society, because this isn't just some kid, this is the foster son of the king. And and this is also the first time I think an elf is fostering a human child. So that's also a bit of a big deal. And this is where I think that Turin now basically has two sort of father figures in a way, but it seems like Baelig is the one constantly chasing after Turin to try to help him out throughout the story. And that doesn't go over well, because nothing ever goes well in the story. Sorry. But it's Also interesting that Melian also is one of them that tries to give advice to Beleg when he goes to chase after Turin, and gives him Lombas and gives him counsel regarding Anglashel, I think it is, the Black Sword, or at least its first name is Anglashel. Then later it's Gurthang, Death of Iron, I think it is. And Melian seems to worry like a mother because this is her foster kid. And I only place emphasis on it because I'm coming from a point of view of someone who's read the Norse sagas, loves them, especially that of Sigmundur and Sigurdur, which are very important. The Volsung saga is the best. So, sorry, I'm biased. So,
I mean, you could tell Tolkien was kind of in the same thought process. I mean, he did his own version of a lot of that stuff. So,
well, that's one thing I do love about Tolkien. He was also a fanboy of these sagas. So, though he was far better read in them than I will ever be, and read them in the original Norse or Icelandic Norse. So I'll never be able to do that. So all I could do is geek out and just say, how awesome is he for having done that? And for him and Lee was reading that fluently in basically going out, getting drunk and discussing it in great detail. I can't even. There are times I can't even properly discuss them sober. So that shows their genius. So, but anyways, I'm also going to quickly, once again, make a comment about Thingol, and I'm a bit of a Thingol fanboy, so you could probably tell. I think that while he does come off as cold in the Baron and Luthien story, the fact that he doesn't hesitate to put the kid on his lap and say, "This is my foster son," and that he keeps, when Beleg says, "Can I have permission to go chase after this kid?" You know, he ran off after what was intended as a prank, but ended up in a
much darker place.
Yeah. Of Soros, the dumbest elf, I think, in the Legendarium. I just call him dumb. I'm sorry, but I don't I get that most things are Turin's own fault, but here I'm with Turin. Soros deserved it.
Yeah, I mean, like his ultimate reaction to it might have been a little overblown, but yeah. I mean, Cyros did try to straight up murder him, so
yeah, and that's like I said, the foster son of his liege lord, and he's just gonna go, okay, I just need to start my day with a bit of murder. I had my coffee, and I need a murder. What the heck are you doing here? But the thing is, the situation is not helped by Turin going, well, obviously Thingol's going to have to pass judgment. I'm not facing that judgment. I'm getting the heck out of Dodge, which this is just, I'm just going to shake my head at him and go, all you need to do is go in front of Thingol and tell the truth. Because, well, there's, what's the term in English? There's, I think in legal, well, you're a lawyer, so you'd be better placed on how to word it. There's, he's able to, he has not justifiable deniability, but there's a certain
justifiable homicide.
Yeah. Okay. That's basically, I think, kind of what he can argue here. But Turin here runs from being icy to being hot-headed and racing away. And when Thingol hears the truth from Nellis, who was a girl who followed around Turin, and the only person to kind of get a happy ending out of this, and well, not a happy ending, but she kind of
not a disastrous ending.
Yeah. And you have Beleg who decides, okay, I'm going to go chase after Turin and try to help him and clean up his mess. Fat chance of that. And the thing is, you have Thingol who says, yeah, okay, please do that. I really do like this kid. I don't want anything bad to happen to him. You know, if you can, get him to come back. He's not going to face punishment. he can come back home. Please get him to come back home. And Turin doesn't do that because he's decided, well, he joins up with a few bandits, decides he names himself Nathan the Wronged, which shows what his mindset is about his crime, and gets into trouble, and Baelig is caught by Turin, and Turin and Baelig kind of start to make amends, and Baelig goes back briefly and to Thingol to report to him, and Thingol and Melian go, okay, you want to go chase after him again? Sure. Whatever you need, whatever you want, you got it. We'll finance the whole thing, get him to come back home. And of course, Turin is no longer really a brigand by the time Baelig finds him again. Instead, he's decided to do a good deed, which we know, as said, it's going to blow up in his face because everything does. And Turin ends up meeting up with a petty dwarf by the name of Mim, who bandies about curses like they're going out of style because he curses one of Turin's companions for the accidental murder of his son, which there I'm going to say not entirely Mim's fault because, well, that no parent should ever bury their child. And ever. And the thing is, Mim seems to have a weird, how do I word it? Possessive side over Turin. He doesn't seem to like sharing Turin with Baelig for one thing and some of the other bandits. And Baelig also helps the one former bandit who was cursed not to ever use a bow and arrow again, only to pick him up again, and Baelig heals him when he's injured, and Mim isn't impressed and then decides, sell out these guys. I want them to move out of my place. He's not the best landlord. I'm just saying. But ultimately, Turin and Baelig are captured. Baelig frees himself and runs into Gwyndor. I believe that's how the story goes.
Baelig isn't actually captured. He's just kind of left for dead.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that correction. Which humorously happens a few times in the Tale of Sigmundr, or at least sort of once. He's captured, believed to be dead eventually, and from what I remember. And the trouble is, Baelig ends up chasing after Turin, because even if he's not sure if Turin's alive, but he might as well bury his body. And Turin, it turns out, is alive, and while cutting the ropes, Anglashell accidentally nicks Turin. Turin gets angry, not knowing who it is that's attacked him. He's afraid. Somehow wrestles the sword out of Baelig's hand and slays Baelig, and flash of lightning later, he kind of recognizes who it is he slew and realizes it's his. Okay, he's collecting father figures here, so dad number 2 or 3, something like that. And I'm just saying,
yeah.
I know Girl Next Gondor, our mutual great friend, is fond of saying that Turin collects names, but he also collects father figures.
It's kind of true.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to say that Baelig's kind of my favorite of the dad figures. So I'm a little saddened that Baelig bites the bullet. And Gwyndor saves Turin by convincing him, okay, let's go to Nargothrond because we're not in any condition to continue the fight from here on out. We got to retreat and rally and figure out our next move. Turin, when in Nargothrond, makes a mess of that too, because that's kind of his thing. And I'm just looking at my list of names for him. He has Anglashell reforged into Girthing, as mentioned, and Turin's names that I'm going to just recite them all to get this out of the way. You have Adanethel, man-elf, Igerwain, son of Umarth, Bloodstained, son of Ill-Fate, kind of a bleak name there. Gorthol, the Dreadhelm. I like that one. Mormagil, the Black Sword. Actually, the Black Sword he's often called by reputation.
Right.
A lot
He's
of places.
constantly wielding it after he gets to Nargothrond.
Yeah. Nathan the Wronged, as mentioned. Turin, which is secret. Turambar, Master of Doom. And yeah, although I wonder how Hurin would have felt about being called Ill Fate. Sorry. It's just a thought that occurred to me. I wonder, because technically Umarth would be what Hurin's inadvertently nicknamed.
Yeah, although I don't really think that's how Turin meant it.
Yeah, just that he was self-pitying there, which I guess he's entitled to it. And from there, Turin, because he's a bad boy, I guess, ends up attracting the eye of Finduilas, daughter of Orodreth and princess of Nargothrond. And that doesn't lead anywhere good. And Turin starts to give really bad counsel to Orodreth, which is to say, stop fighting by guerrilla tactic and just build a giant bridge and go fight Morgoth out in the open, because it worked so well for Maethros and everyone else. Like it's worked out. Like third time's a charm. This time it has to work. How bad can I screw up?
Especially with a smaller army.
Yeah, whole army is destroyed. Orodreth is killed, which that itself is a disaster because he is the king of a pretty powerful, sizable realm. And of course, Glaurung claims the castle of Nargothrond for himself because dibs, but not before he sends off Turin on a wild goose chase to Dorlomin, where Turin makes a mess of that and causes the deaths of, I believe, Sador, for example, which, along with the claimant to his father's house and the man's wife, are all dead by the time he leaves. And he retires to Brethil, which is a place that Thingol had given over to the House of Haleth, I believe. And it's Brandir who shows him a lot of kindness and takes him in. Brandir being the mayor of Brethil. And quite a bit later, not long after, you have Morwen, who decides that she can't let her son outdo her at his poor decisions, so she's going to go out and make her own bad decisions out of pride and ego, and proceeds to get separated from Mablung, who's acting as her escort, and her daughter. Nienor is enchanted to have her memory suppressed, and Nienor just ends up dashing off like a madwoman, is found by Turin, who marries her, because Tolkien was inspired by Kalervo, and that, which is Finnish mythology and apparently a great epic. I should get a copy of that. And it looks like an interesting read. But Nienor is named Niniel by Turin, so she started collecting names. And sometime later, after the two are married, and you have Glaurung, who, hearing that the Black Sword is back because the orcs started pressing into Brethil, or near that area, Turin picks up the Black Sword again, and you have Glaurung who decides, okay, it's war. I got to go out and go after him. I got to finish the job because Morgoth's not going to be impressed if I don't. And, well, Turin does a good imitation of Sigurdur with Fafnir, sticks the sword up his guts, and temporarily KO'd. Turin swoons, I guess. I don't know how to describe it. He's knocked out, I guess. Nienor finds him, thinks he's deceased. Glaurung takes off the memory suppressant and tells her, well, what she's done. She throws herself off a cliff, because why not? And Turin wakes up, discovers the truth, goes back to Brethir, and Brandir kind of points out to him what It's happened. Brandir does not live to tell the tale because, well, you taunted a guy maddened with rage and grief right now. So I guess Brandir's kind of competing for piss poor decisions here. I don't know. It doesn't seem like anyone's making wise decisions here, except maybe Melian. I don't know.
Just imagine how much better things had gone if everybody had just listened to her advice.
Yeah.
That's really kind of the key lesson of the Silmarillion is just listen to Melian.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting is that by the Third Age, everybody has learned their lesson and listens to Gandalf. So this is kind of what would have happened. Like this sort of scenario is probably what would have happened had people not listened to Gandalf in the Third Age. So
yeah, it only took about 6,000 years.
Better late than never. But you then have you have Turin who runs into Mablung, who confirms that Nienor is missing, and tellingly describes Nienor to him, and at which point Turin goes, "Oh, okay, I'm gonna go." In your words, and then it's been a bad run. Let's not make it worse by stretching this out. Sorry if I keep quoting you. It's a good quote. Sorry, you really.
That does seem to be what's on his mind. He's like, it's gone from bad to worse to worse. Let's just no more.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be honest. When I first read that scene, and even on this read through, I was filled with a lot of pity for him. Like, I know a lot of people, some people dislike him, like clueless fangirl, but I've got a lot of pity for Turin. I do know he's got his flaws. He's not perfect, gosh no, but he is a figure I find that at this point he's kind of pitiable, and everything he's ever done has just made things worse. And he slays himself with Gurthang, who's at this point a talking sword, and at least for one scene, and that's it. He's buried there, and quite a bit of time later, I think months later, Hurin shows up to find Morwen there, and this is probably the most gut-wrenching scene in this story because, well, both of them buried their kid, and Hurin then has to bury Morwen as she can't, she's dying. And at this point, Hurin turns around, heads down to Brethil, turns people against each other, and then continues on the road, stopping by Nargothrond to put an end to Mim and avenge his son there, and then to go to Thingol and toss the Naglomir at his feet, which is cursed with, I think it's dragon sickness. And Thingol is then told in rather harsh language that his foster son is dead, at which point Melian clears Hurin's mind, and Hurin ends up apologizing, then leaves to go and follow in his daughter's footsteps by jumping off a cliff into the sea. And thus, this is the end of the House of Hurin. And really, this is probably the most depressing story in, I'm going to say, fantasy fiction, because it doesn't get much more depressing. And I'm just saying. But I would argue that the other epilogue is Thingol, decides, let's put the Silmaril in the Naglomir, because that can't go wrong, and is slain in his basement by his dwarves, whom he's hired, who I guess wanted a pay increase, but he said, no, you've been paid enough, and they insisted they wanted the Silmaril in Naglomir. Thingol said no, they slay him, and thus this leads to even more disaster, because that's where the Silmarillion's headed at this point. Disaster after disaster on everyone's parts. With that said, as for the overall themes, it seems like Tolkien, like I said, was borrowing heavily from the Cullervo, he originally intended this to be a novelization of Kullervo, then took it in his own direction. So I wonder if that makes it count as a kind of fan fiction.
Well, there's a sense in which everything Tolkien or almost anybody else ever does is fan fiction because it's all been done before.
Yep.
So, but yeah, I mean, I've read the story of Kullervo, which came out, I don't remember how many years ago now. And the very early stuff, like the original story and Tolkien's kind of first take on it, it's a lot more simple than the very developed Children of Hurin. But you can see it's there. I mean, the germ of everything is there, and then he just starts adding little bits and little bits and little bits, and the next thing you know, you've got this grand sweeping tragedy. But I mean, the story of Kullervo itself is in itself tragic, so it's not like he added the tragedy, but he just added more and more elements, like throwing in the Sigurd Fafnir thing, all these different little elements that he just put in there to really flesh the story out. And by the time he was done, it's arguably my favorite story that he ever wrote.
I think it's my favorite story of the Silmarillion, but I don't know if it might be my favorite story that Tolkien ever wrote. It's very well developed and very tragic.
Yeah, it's the only downside is he never quite finished it in its most developed form. And when you read the Children of Hurin, you can see that, because if you're paying attention, you can tell where it's like Silmarillion brevity, really expansive, detailed narrative, Silmarillion brevity. It just kind of has. If you're paying attention to how the narrative goes, you can see that shift back and forth, because there just wasn't the completed narrative in certain parts of the story. And it's really disappointing, because if he had managed to do the entire thing and really get it all developed to that degree, I mean, it's astonishing to think what it could have been in that form. And I still think that of all the stuff you could put to film from Tolkien's work, that might be the one that I would most want to see.
Same. I'm not gonna lie, I'd want to see it animated though. I'm not keen on live action films at this point. I'm weird. I'm rather sick of them. I find when it comes to fantasy fiction, I'm done with them. If people disagree with it, go ahead. I know I'm a weirdo. I just want to see someone like Don Bluth or something do this story, because I like his art style, and I like Bluth. And I know this would be really outside of his realm. He wouldn't ever want to do this because he prefers children's stories and whatnot, not the dark
very
story.
Mature, yeah. It's a very different kind of thing.
But maybe Ralph Bakshi or something would be good, and just do this animated, so that way you can capture the whole scope of the Children of Hurin and the dagger, not the dagger, the Arnoet, the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. Sorry about that. And I think that in animated form, it would be also easy to, well, for one thing, I'd want to see the interior of Menegroth animated with all the tapestries and everything, because that's a part which Dan and I, when we were doing our Silmarillion podcast, really just went, wait, hold on, it's telling the past, present, and future. That's creepy. And that's something I'd want to see, and as well as the Fafnir thing, because
oh yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want to see that scene?
Yeah. But when it comes to the Volsung saga, I'm actually going to brag about one thing. It's something I kind of had in common with Tolkien, in that I grew up with that story as a kid. So I was pretty young when I first read it, and I was encouraged weirdly by a math teacher to read it, and my dad. I just say it's weird because, well,
you don't think of math teachers being that into mythology.
No, but she really was. She would give me access to a computer and tell me I could read all the old. It had to be old classic stories. I was not allowed to do anything else with the computer if I finished my homework ahead of time. So it was a weird kind of school. And I would decide it's either that or Halo, and I was the weird kid who said mythology. And yeah, so, but the thing is, the sword Graham has in common with Anglashell the fact that it's broken at one point and reforged. Though difference between Sigurdur, is that, and Turin is that Turin does not reforge it, I think, with his own hands, whereas Sigurdur does.
Right.
And the other thing is that Sigurdur is not the character who does incest; it's his dad. And the whereas with Hurin, he doesn't do that. And there's all their little differences, but the main thing I noted down is that uh, there's an entire almost epic just about Sigmundur before you even get to the story of the Nibelungen, I think it's called. And in French, I think it's just something like Nibelung. But then there's the name is longer in English and German. You guys are weird. You stretch out names like that. But the other thing is that in the story of Sigmundur, it's not some great big god or devil figure who kind of lays low the Volsung's family, and the Volsung's sons, but it is Signy, their in-law, who wants Graham, the sword, and is jealous of Sigmundur. And so he just has everyone killed and ties Sigmundur to a tree and says, all right, we'll let a she-wolf kill him. At which point, Siggeir puts honey on her brother's face, and the she-wolf kind of likes that honey better than meat. So, and eventually she ends up laying with her brother and producing, I just cringe and grimace because, yeah. But there's a son who comes out of it and becomes a great warrior in his own right. And he's later slain before his father. So there's themes in common with parents burying their children, and Sigmundur, though, also ends up, now that I think about it, he has something in common with Huor in that his wife is with child when he ends up going off to battle and dying. So Rianne, I think it is. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. How do you usually pronounce her name?
I pronounce it Rian.
Okay, so we're on the same page. I think, and she ends up giving birth to Tuor before she goes to try to find her husband. That's long before Turin's even going around screwing things up in his life. But so I'm just taking note of the similarities because Tolkien was very strongly influenced not only by Kullervo but by Sigmundur and Sigurdur because he was a Norse mythology fanboy. And that is a side of him that I also think that people, to an extent, have overstated, because I only say they overstate it because I've seen some people just kind of forget that there's also classical mythological influence, because the tone of Children of Hurin is also akin to, I should say, the story of Oedipus Rex and Oedipus's daughter. I blanked on her name for a moment. Antigone, and a lot of the other tragic Greek figures like Achilles and whatnot. Well, Achilles and Turin have a lot in common. They both screw themselves up a lot. And I'd even argue Paris has something in common with Turin being a screw up. But I'm just saying that I think one should also mention the classical education of Tolkien as an influence on his story, because he was a classically educated person. Everybody was at that time.
Right.
So, like I said, I just want to bring that up because outside of Helen, I think most people I've talked to don't really mention the Greek and Roman influence. It's mostly Norse and whatnot. Because I spoke to Helen some time ago, and she mentioned that when she reads a lot of these stories, she does see a lot of Greek mythology in there, and I thought that's worth a mention.
Yeah, well, and like the pantheon of the Valar is much easier to kind of correlate with a Greek pantheon than a Norse one. The Norse gods are not really quite the same kind of thing.
No. The difference is the Norse gods are doomed, and they're thematically they're walking to their doom with the idea of, well, we have to behave honorably and we have to meet our destiny or our doom with our heads held high. We have to do this kind of nobly. Whereas the Greek gods are in it for fun.
Pretty much.
Yeah,
they're just as hedonistic and fickle as all the humans that they lorded over.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that the Norse gods are entirely free of that
perfect.
charge. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they're not just a bunch of fickle people going around, like the amount of marital infidelity among the Greek gods is kind of insane.
Yeah. It's staggering.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think the most well-adjusted marriage in that mythology is probably Hades and Persephone, and
that's
they
pretty ironic.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember a few of my classical mythology professors just commenting on how ironic that is, and going, "That's funny," and just wanting to make an entire joke out of it. But thematically, I wonder. I just want to ask real quick, because I believe it's Ale is the one who forged Anglashell.
Right.
And with Anglashell Gurthang, talking at one point, I wonder if there was a bit of ale that got poured into Anglashell.
Well, certainly Melian hints at that, because she says the spirit of its maker is in the sword. A lot of people, whenever I did my video on that topic a little while ago, commented and said, and they have a point, that Turin, when he kills himself, is apparently alone. So who is there to hear that and report that Gurthang spoke? Like, how does anybody know that happened? Now, you could surmise, because Moblung and the other elves were chasing after Turin, that they were just close enough that when he got far enough ahead and stopped and decided to kill himself, they heard the voices from whatever distance they were and just came up too late to stop him from actually committing the act of suicide. It's not clear in the text that that's the case, but if you don't assume that, then you do have to ask yourself the question, where did this account of the sword talking come from?
Yeah.
Because it seems like a really weird thing to make up. Like, oh, we just came across him and saw he was dead, so let's tell this story about how he talked to the sword about... Because, like, do any of them even know that he killed Beleg? Who would even know that, right?
Yeah.
Gwendor would know that, but Gwendor's dead, and presumably nobody else in Nargothrond would have known that. So,
and I don't think Gwendor would have liked talking about it.
Well, right. I mean, he wouldn't have gone and spread that around. He was much better a friend than that.
The only person I think he might be tempted to tell would be his king, because relationship of monarch and vassal.
Right. But for that reason, I almost have to think that Moblung, or one of the elves with him, must have been just close enough to hear it happen.
Well, we do know that they have very good keen eyes, as mentioned. Right. Lord of the Rings does a good job showing that. So I wonder if their ears are as keen as their eyes.
I I'm trying to remember if there actually is some reference to elvish ears being particularly. I don't remember. There may be, and there may not be.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking of the pointed elvish ears. I was just thinking how uh, how
Well,
keen their hearing is.
that's what I mean. I can't remember if there's actually a reference to that. Although it would seem to be implied, at least by some things, like the fact that the dwarf breathed so loud that we could have shot him in the dark. You know, that implies at least that elves can hear really well, because even if Gimli is breathing particularly loudly, could you hear
Yeah,
that from the top of a tree?
that's
As a
pretty
normal
unlikely.
human, probably not.
Probably
So
not.
yeah, I mean, I tend to think Moblung and or some of the elves with him must have actually heard that, because I don't know how else to explain it. Which then, going back to your original question, I mean, what else would that be other than the dark spirit of Aeol, which was somehow put into the sword? Which we know from other things that other elves say, that the love of what they, the
Create.
right, that tends to have effects on what they do. The elven cloaks that they hand out in Lothlorien, the limbus itself, even the blades of Westerness are kind of imparted with something. And of course, the elvish blades made in Gondolin glow blue because of the hatred of the orcs. So
And on
seemingly
top,
both love and hatred kind of go into the things they make, and Aeol kind of hates everybody. So
yeah, but that's also something that Tolkien took from Norse mythology because Tyrfing, a sword that seems to that when drawn in Norse mythology has to kill someone no matter what, was forged with the hatred of its dwarvish smith, imbuing it with his anger and hatred because he was imprisoned against his will.
yeah,
Um, and he didn't appreciate it and was made to forge a weapon for his boss. So he forged Tyrfing, and it led to an entire series of tragedies because everybody who'd well, it would basically get drawn, have to kill someone, whether the user or his victim, and the person, and so it kept passing into the hands of the next person until finally, uh, well, it killed everyone in one location. So it's a pretty bleak story. I'm
but
pretty sure you're probably familiar with it.
even that kind of ties back into Gurthong, because Gurthong is, or Onglachel, depending on when you say it. There's like I don't remember who says it and when exactly, but somebody says something along the lines of, or it may just be the narrator, but like every flesh that it pricks, it will kill. So it's
Hmm.
like if it gets you at any point, you're dead. Which, as I pointed out in the video I made not too long ago, seemingly Turin escapes this when he gets pricked by it when Beleg is trying to cut him loose, but then he kills himself with it later.
Yeah, I was about to comment on that. Yeah, he does because I haven't. Sorry, I usually watch your videos. I didn't. I've been too busy for that one. I'm weeks behind.
I
And then,
can't keep up with everybody's. It's impossible. It's just too
yeah,
much. But yeah, I mean, Turin is the only one who gets hit by it in some way that doesn't die pretty much instantly. I mean, Glaurung has a little bit of a long drawn out death, but I mean, he's dying.
yeah,
But Turin eventually offs himself with the same sword, so it still fulfills that condition of if it cuts you, it kills you.
kind of like Tyrfing from Norse mythology.
Right.
You pull it out, somebody's gonna die. Which you'd think that would just convince people to just keep it in the sheath and toss it into the ocean. But
Right?
yeah, like oh,
Nobody seems to take these things very seriously.
yeah, yeah, and it's buried at one point in the myths, and then somebody gets the idea. I'm going to go to the that cemetery, and I'm going to go and bury that sword because I want that sword. Which, yeah, you roll your eyes.
That's one of those. It's kind of like, in real life, how you'll sometimes say, well, if this was a movie, that's kind of one of those moments. It's like if you knew you were in a story, you would know how this is going to go.
Yeah, and you'd think, like you said, you'd think everyone would start listening eventually to Melian. Um, but I'd argue that Thingol, when it comes to after the story, when he goes Silmaril now. I don't know how to call it. Now Glimmer slash Silmaril.
Right.
I'd argue that his will is kind of broken in a way. Like he's resisted the temptation of the Silmaril for so long, but between the dragon sickness and the combination of Nauglamir and Silmaril and the death of Turin, it kind of breaks something in him so that he's, I guess, willing to give in. I don't know what you think of that.
I don't know that Turin's death necessarily has much to do with it. I mean, you get the impression through Tolkien's writings that one of Thingol's natural weaknesses is greed.
Yeah.
And this comes up in The Hobbit, which you would think like Thingol's not in The Hobbit, but like the woodland king is
Has
clearly based on Thingol. He had already created the character of Thingol by that point, and he imports so much of that kind of stuff into The Hobbit without directly referring, because he can't do it because it's not published. But one of the things that it says about the woodland elven king in The Hobbit is he was kind of unhappy because his hoard was not as big as other people's hoards.
and he
And if
also wants his emeralds.
right. So, but if you pay attention, like the woodland king lives where? In a giant wood in a cave, and he's not as rich as everybody else, which means the
Yeah.
Noldor. It's Thingol. He just renames him.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to disagree there. I just think there is the weakness of greed with Thingol, but I also kind of read it into him that there might have been a bit of that emotional investment in Turin. And
Could be. And
yeah,
I think Hurin's final words to him probably did kind of hit home a little bit. Like, he probably did not take that very well.
no. And yet it seems like, okay, I'll just quickly, because I got a copy of the novel. Well, I say novel, but it's more like stories. Let me see. No, I don't have it. I don't have the Death of Hurin here, uh, but it seems like Thingol did try to show compassion to Hurin because clearly Hurin's a little out of his mind with grief.
Not to mention he's been a captive for 20 plus, 30 plus years.
I think like around 23 or 28 years or something.
Something. Because I
Something
think,
like
I want to say Turin's around 33 when he dies, if I'm not mistaken. And since
that.
he
Yeah.
was 9-ish at the near knife, that would make it 24 years,
Okay. I'm just
if I'm
thinking.
remembering right.
Yeah. If it's, I think it's around, I'm going to actually look that up if that's okay.
Yeah, I know
Real
it's
quick.
more than 20, but that's the only thing I'm really certain of. Because yeah, I mean, Turin's life goes rather quickly. He's a young guy when he dies.
Oh, he's apparently 35 years old.
35. Okay, so then 26 years. Hurin's been sitting in that chair watching tragedy unfold on his family for 26 years.
So that's not a fun weekend.
No.
No. But what's interesting is that I think thematically it's supposed to be an inversion. Like the throne Morgoth forces him on is supposed to be, at least when I first read it, I kind of saw it as a mockery of the chair of the throne Sador carved for Hurin.
That's an interesting point I hadn't considered.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, and that's actually useful too, because I've been trying to put together a list of parallels within the story of Turin, because there are a ton of them. Like for instance, and this is one that was explicitly brought up by Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor, in I forget which class he did. It might have been on the Unfinished Tales when he was covering that. But one of the things that he mentions is, at the very beginning of the story, Turin has this really profound friendship with Sador, who is totally beneath his station, all this stuff, and who is a cripple who, he hit his
Accidentally
own.
chopped his foot off.
Right, he accidentally chopped his own foot with an axe, and he's a cripple. But Turin treats him with a lot of friendship and pity. And then at the very end of the story, he slaughters Brondir, who is a cripple, in cold blood. It's like you put those two together. It's like that's how far Turin has gone downhill, and that's not. There are a lot of other parallels too, and so I'm like keeping a running list of them, and sooner or later I'm going to do a video kind of exploring some of it. But
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, but yeah, I'd never thought of the chair as being like a dark copy of Sodor's throne. That's kind of interesting, and of course, it's a really interesting twist because it's like the one was supposed to be a representation of his lordship and dignity, and the other is
In
you're
mockery of
trapped.
it.
Right, you're trapped here. You cannot leave, and it's just all about making you miserable.
Yeah.
Watching your own family die, which is, or at least have a really hard time.
And if you look at lordship as being built from the ground up, like early medieval period and whatnot, and the ground that this throne is put upon, I believe, is a mountain of corpses. And at one point that he's put on it, and in that mountain isn't Huor's corpse amongst them?
I don't think he puts him on
I thought he was on it at one point.
mound. I don't think he puts him on that mound. I think he's just up in the mountains of the Thongarodrim. But
Yeah, he is amongst the mountains. My mistake. Yeah, but still, it's just that throne is the one thing I can brag that I ended up seeing a parallel of. It's the one thing I can brag about in this.
Hey, take him where you can get him, right?
Yep. But that said, the Brandir and Sador thing I had noted, but I also remember thinking a while back that Turin's non-romance of sorts with Finduilas,
right, is
a really pathetic, and I say pathetic, I don't mean that as
like a put down.
No, not at all. Image of that of Idril and Tuor.
True. Yeah. Well, and that's also interesting too, because Tuor is the one human who, it is said, was joined to the Eldar, and ended up living forever, basically. And he's the only example we have of a man-elf union where one side or the other is not known really to have actually become the other, because Beren and Luthien, of course, Luthien becomes mortal, and then all of their descendants are kind of given that choice.
Yeah.
Dior never really gets to exercise the choice because he gets killed.
Getting himself killed.
Right. But Tuor and Idril, they just disappear out of history, and I mean, we don't really know what happened to them. And then their descendants, of course, they also all get the choice, because Eärendil is given the choice, Elwing is given the choice, and their kids are given the choice. So,
and we're told real quick that Eärendil had immediate buyer's remorse.
Well, yeah, I mean, he wanted to go with men because of his dad, but he let Elwing have the choice and went along with it. So, I mean, hard to fault him. Like, he's just so tired of it all. He's like, you pick. And unfortunately, she picks the one that's going to make him tired for an eternity. But yeah, I mean, and that's another thing too that you could compare a lot in a lot of different ways is Turin and Tuor, because there's a lot of parallels between the two. Like, not just the fact that they both had, well, in Turin's case, an almost romance with an elf, but the other parallel is, of course, there's only two kingdoms of elves left after Doriath goes kaput. Well, actually, Nargothrond goes kaput before Doriath. I'm mixing that up. But there's only two Noldorin kingdoms left, and it's Nargothrond and Gondolin. Turin goes to Nargothrond and pretty much intentionally throws it into the pit.
Yeah.
Not with a motive to do so, but I mean, it was obvious
that.
Yeah. Whereas Tuor goes to Gondolin with the very express intent of, we got to book it out of here so that we can all survive. And it's actually the king who is like, nah, I kind of like it here after all. So there's also those kinds of parallels running in between those two stories
And you
that's
have,
also really interesting.
but you also have Turin, who's opposed in Orodreth's councils by Gwyndor, who's giving good advice because he really cares about Nargothrond.
But nobody pays attention to him either.
Yeah, and you have Finduilas, who's turned away from him. But then you have, in turn, in Gondolin, Tuor is opposed by Maeglin, the nephew of Turgon.
Who's giving bad advice.
Yeah. So you kind of have these parallels in both kingdoms. But the difference is where Turin is kind of like Sigurdur and Kullervo, Tuor is more like Aeneas. And,
yeah. That's a very good parallel.
Thank you. I'll take my victories where I can get them. So that's 2 of them. But yeah, like I think the other thing one thing I like about Gondolin is that it's not as tragic. At least I find it's not as depressing as Children of Hurin.
Right. Well, and all the tragedy in the fall of Gondolin comes at the very end, which it's kind of coming for the entire trip, because the chapter is called The Fall of Gondolin, and also as soon as Tuor gets there, Turgon is just like, nah, and then you're like, I mean, I guess
what you good decision.
Right. I mean, instead of nobody listens to Melian, you could just say the Silmarillion is just all about not listening to good advice. Like, Windor should have been listened to, Ulmo should have been listened to, Tuor should have been listened. Like, nobody ever listens to good advice. If somebody says, I'm going to ignore that and go with this one, you can pretty much bet the one they ignored was the right choice in the Silmarillion every time. But yeah, I mean, all the tragedy in Gondolin comes right at the very end where it actually falls. The rest of the story is actually very uplifting because Tuor comes from literally nothing. He's a slave of these other men who have taken over. He escapes. He joins up with some elves. He makes it to Vinyamar, sees Ulmo in all of his, glory, and then makes his way and finds Varanwe finds their way to Gondolin and sees the greatest kingdom of elves in Middle Earth ever, and becomes basically like an elf, which is also really funny because that one of the names of Turin was Adonithel, which means elf man.
Man elf.
Or man elf. Yeah, depending on how you want to look at it. But yeah, I mean, in order, Adon man and Evel elf, but I mean, it's, I think the noun adjective order is kind of reversed for English, because he's a man but he's like an elf, and that's one of the things that's commented on him is he is as beautiful as an elf in a lot of people's eyes. And that's, you have to remember, Morwen, her kind of epithet was Elethwin, which means elf sheen. His mother was also seen as being very elvish in her beauty, and he inherits that, and so that's why a lot of people call him that. Tuor doesn't get called that, but he's the one who actually ends up being very much an elf in all other ways. So it's kind of fascinating, that parallel as well.
The other difference between Turin and Tuor is that Tuor makes good decisions, Turin doesn't.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. One makes really, really bad decisions. The other one makes really, really, really good decisions.
Yeah. And they almost meet each other.
Yeah. Thank heavens they don't.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't have gone well, actually.
No. Turin would have screwed it up.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. I may like him, I may pity him, but he'd have messed it all up. Tuor was better off without him.
Yeah.
But I'm also going to note one little thing. Huor, when he dies, an arrow to the eye, also makes me think real quick of Harold II from English history, the last Anglo-Saxon king. So just going to mention that. And there's a lot of bad that happens after that for England for a while. So
especially if you're like Tolkien and hate the Norman conquest.
Yeah, I'm French and I hate the Norman conquest because I'm just filled with pity for the English of that era because I had to read a good chunk of that. Well, when I did my bachelor's, I did a chunk in Anglo-Saxon history, so it was just, oh God, what Guillaume did to them, Guillaume de Conquérant, William the Conqueror.
Right.
It's like, wow, wow. But then you have, I had a thought in my head about who was it? Okay, I mentioned Huor, but there was another parallel I just took notice of.
Harold? You're talking about the
Not
Huor and
after
Harold?
Harold,
Oh,
but like,
after that?
yeah, but I can't quite. Oh, and I think there's also, uh, no, no, I forgot it. Frick. As I'm getting older, my brain's not working the same way it used to, sadly.
It only gets worse, unfortunately.
Oh, gosh darn it. Uh, can't I have a comforting line and have you say it'll get better?
Hey, we make up for it with greater wisdom.
Okay. Well, that's a perk. That's a perk. Which, uh, but as for, well, I'll just say one other thing. I think Turin probably could have used help from Gandalf if he were around at that time. Although
He
I doubt
probably
he
wouldn't
would.
have listened, though.
No. And but as for what was it? Sorry, I'm really struggling to remember because I had a point in my head. But let's see. Well, it's never gonna come back to me.
It
The
will
thought
after we end
was
the stream.
what?
It will after we end the stream.
Then it's gonna come back, and I'm gonna go.
Yep.
Has that happened to you?
I mean, not on a live stream type thing, but I've had instances where I'll be doing something and I'll try to remember something, and then only after remembering it is no longer of any value, I'll then remember it and be like, why now? You know?
Yeah,
Such is life, but whatever.
yeah. And as for, well, all I'm gonna ask real quick is, as a delaying method till the thought either comes back or whatever. But what are your thoughts on the possibility of how much influence Morgoth has?
I tend toward the reading that the curse of Morgoth is really not effective so long as Turin is not in a position that Morgoth can directly get at him. Like, there's not like a dark cloud hovering over his
No.
head, making everything go wrong. The curse is really just a function of, does Morgoth know where he is? And if so, what can he do to interfere with his life? So, Glaurung attacking Nargothrond and then attacking Brethil, and the orcs attacking Amon Ruth where they're hiding out with Meme. These are all things that are kind of consciously directed at Turin because Morgoth knows where he is. Like, short of that, and it's even kind of explicitly stated in the narrative a little bit, because he even Morgoth even kind of thinks to himself, like, if I can't ever find this guy again, I'm not going to be able to make my curse effective. So I've got to, like, take him captive now and make him miserable for the rest of his life. I can't just let him go out there and so Morgoth cannot, I don't think, make things that he does go badly. Like he does in the sense that when he builds the bridge across the river Narog and then has Orodreth send his armies out into the open, and then he knows where Nargothrond is. He makes that go badly because he has Glaurung attack Nargothrond, but it's not, I'm just going to magically make this all work out poorly in his favor. Well, no, it's just, it was a dumb decision by Turin, which Morgoth then takes massive advantage of. So that's kind of where I fall on that, is like the curse is really completely powerless unless Morgoth knows where he is and can do something about it.
Yeah, and I'm actually of a similar mind. I also tend to think that, to an extent, uh, I don't know if this is nonsense, but I believe from what I remember reading from the chapter where Glaurung meets the gaze of Turin, I believe Glaurung is also the avatar of Morgoth.
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah, where it's like, I'm never very good at explaining the idea of an avatar, but
It's kind of like
where
the spirit of Morgoth is speaking through Glaurung
that's
almost.
exactly it. You worded that better than I could have. And I think that, and so I always wonder if there's direct conflict here through Glaurung between Turin and Morgoth. I just wonder how much independence does Glaurung even have?
That is an interesting question and one that I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer.
Okay, not on the spot.
I mean, you definitely do have an element of that. On the one hand, Glaurung seems to be his own thing because he just
Yeah,
after Nargothrond is sacked, he just plops down on his bed of gold and he's like, "Can't make me do anything, Morgoth. Just come and do whatever you want." Which that can't be Morgoth's plan to just have the giant father of dragons sit there on a hoard of gold and do nothing else to wreak havoc on elven kingdoms, right?
and
So he seems like
later
an independent actor, but it also seems like Morgoth does in some way
influence.
channel through.
Yeah. What I was going to comment though, later the dialogue between Glaurung and Nienor uh, ends up, like the dialogue reminds me of the actual dialogue of Fafnir from my copy of the Volsungs saga and whatnot. So that's it, Nienor. Sorry, I
Hey, it
I'm
came
sorry.
before the stream ended, so that's good.
Yes, victory.
Yeah.
Like, sorry, that's a victory for me. Victoire. Um, the parallel I was going to draw was just that if Turin is like his mother, I believe in the text it's referenced that Nienor is more like their father in personality.
Yeah. I mean, and that kind of carries through too with just the hair color. I mean, like Tolkien is not above doing white hat, black hat type
Yeah,
stuff. Turin inherits Morwen's dark hair, Nienor inherits Hurin's golden hair, and she's very much not like her mother. She is hot-headed, feisty, and very much more in the Hurin mold
smarter
than,
than her mom.
but not above making really poor decisions, as we see.
Yeah,
But that's kind of what this story is. It's the story of poor decisions. But yeah, I mean, she definitely is much more like Hurin than Turin is, because Turin's personality in large measure comes from Morwen, and not entirely, because he's got a little bit of his dad in him that he doesn't totally mesh with his mom,
mm,
because he does have that instinct to pity, which is more of a Hurin thing. Morwen is
yeah,
much more aloof, but Nienor seems to have, like if Turin is like 80 to 90% Morwen and then 10 to 20 Hurin, Nienor is like the flip opposite of
the
that.
flipped version.
Yeah.
Yeah, Turin is essentially also uh, Cull from Howard's Legendarium. If he didn't have Brull to occasionally come in and tell him, "What the heck are you doing?" and slap him upside the head and tell him, "Get back in line. Do it. Don't do that stupid decision." I just have to reference Howard because I only recently discovered him and I've really taken to his literature. Um, I don't know if you've ever read.
No,
All
I
of
was
them.
going to say, here's where you've lost me because I
Sorry,
understand nothing about that.
uh,
I mean, that's fine.
it's
Um,
Robert E. Howard, who
right.
was
I
the
know, I
American.
know vaguely who he is, but like I've never
Okay.
read any of his stuff. So,
Okay. Well, his Cull character is a very. He spends too much time in his head. He's very depressed most of the time, except when he then has to go out and make a really piss poor decision. And then his best friend and sworn brother, Brol, will trail after him, slap him upside the head, and drag him back and say, "What the heck were you thinking?" Of Cull, I don't know. I just wanted to try doing that. And
sounds like Baelic and Turin kind of.
yeah, yeah, it's just like that bond, except the two are more like brothers, and they call each other brothers, even though they're not biologically related.
Right.
They're actually from rival tribes, but they somehow ended up becoming sworn brothers. And but then, of course, Howard abandons them for Conan, who's uh, a lot more like Aragorn in personality. Well, not exactly in personality, but in archetype. And rather than Kull, who's just like, he's a great character. It's just sometimes you're just left shaking your head and going, "What are you thinking, man?" Well, the thing with Kull is he nearly brings about the end of the world because he was bored and because he wanted to prove he wasn't scared. So, yeah, but Turin kind of makes what?
Sounds like something Turin would do.
Yeah, but that's Turin. I'll just end the stream with saying is because I'm really interested in, like, I'm not professionally trained in, but because my brother's more the psychology major, I just occasionally like to read some of the stuff he passes over to me, such as Campbell, Jung, and whatnot. And from what I can see, it seems like Turin's more the shadow warrior archetype, a very insecure warrior who's a bit of a, I think in, because it's like when I saw it, it's like an image of a triangle. You have the warrior in his fullness, who's uh, great, who's like Gawain from Arthurian myths.
Right.
You have on one downside the sadist, who's well, the word speaks for itself, and you have on the other side the masochist, and I would argue Turin's kind of maybe the masochist, and he gets moments where he's the warrior in his fullness, like he does truly great things, but then he just sinks back down into the mire and screws it all up over and
self-destructs.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're familiar with any of these Jungian Campbellian theories.
I mean, I've heard of some of them a little bit, but I've never gotten into like a deep dive. So, but I mean, what you're saying, I can totally see the parallel. It does seem to ring kind of true because, like, Tuor would be the warrior in his fullness.
Yeah,
that's kind of Tuor, whereas Turin is not.
Yeah.
Let's just say.
And of course, Aragorn, for example, would be the king. Same with, Melian would be the queen archetype, basically dispensing wisdom and trying to help everyone that they can, but not everyone takes their advice.
Right.
Funny thing is, I saw a video essay that at one point said that Theoden starts off as the insecure king and becomes the proper full king archetype. So I thought that was something I remember. Yeah. So there's ways that characters can rise from one of the shadow archetypes into being the full one, and Turin doesn't. In turn, Hurin seems to go from the warrior in his fullness and falls into, I guess, the sadist a little.
Yeah, I mean, I think he kind of hits all three at different points in his career.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there's points where he's very self-destructive, but there's also like towards the end, he's more of the sadist because he just gets to the point where he's just like, I want my way, and I'm not gonna brook any opposition. And if you try to tell me I'm wrong, I'll cut you down. Like in his worst moments.
Yeah, Hurin does get those moments because you have Brethel, you have Mim, and that he completely screws up. One last thing. I know I keep saying that. What are your thoughts on Turgon turning away Hurin when he comes crying out near the mountains?
I mean, it was the smart move because
Hurin's cursed.
Well, and you don't really know, like, Morgoth doesn't just let people out willy-nilly and then just forget about them. I mean, by that point, I think it was already pretty well established that elves could have the spell of bottomless dread on them, that, an elf might escape, but they're always going to have like Morgoth's eye in the back of their mind, and they're going to do things that they would not normally do. So Turgon kind of had to assume at that point that Hurin is not to be trusted, even
Yeah.
if it's not Hurin's own fault. Like, not that Hurin is actively acting as a spy or something, but that, trying to be nice to him is going to backfire. And he was right, because Morgoth's servants were watching. So, and that's how he finally learns that, okay, Gondolin is somewheres around here on the map.
I'm going to say there, insert random spot.
Yeah. So the fact that he was watching proves that Turgon was, he made the smart decision in the end. Although it does also seem to imply that it's not merely from practical considerations, but also a little bit cold-heartedness.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
there's a slight hint of that in the text in my reading anyway, which,
Yeah.
it's, and the hint there may be something to the effect that if Turgon was properly morally and empathetically aligned, he might have actually done Hurin the favor, let him back in despite the risk. And if he had that frame of mind, then when Tuor finally shows up, he would have abandoned Gondolin. And then even though it would have backfired, it wouldn't have mattered because he would have already been gone.
Yeah.
You know,
I do think you make a good point there. I hadn't thought about it quite that extensively, but okay. So yeah, I remember just thinking, okay, that's cold. But on the other hand, I kind of saw it as, well, I don't agree with the decision. I think that the king in his fullness archetype, thinking in those terms, like I kind of thought of it as, well, that's cold. I don't know if he could have made any other decision. But then when I looked at it from a Campbellian point of view, I was like, well, if he had done the right decision, wouldn't that mean that the story might have a different ending? But you ended up laying it out really well there, so can't argue. And I just have a lot of pity for, I guess, for Hurin and Turin. But with Turin, I also kind of go, well, it's his own decision. And I do wonder if, to an extent, Morgoth also letting Hurin out was kind of the my favorite movie or show on television ever was Merlin from 1998. And I don't know if you've
is this
seen
the
it.
one with Sam Neill?
Yep.
Okay.
I love Sam Neill. I'm a fanboy of his. I've watched almost his every movie, almost all his movies. I love them all. But in that movie, there's at one point Mab, who's kind of the more Gothian figure of that story. She strips one of her former servants after he turns on her of all his magic, and he ends up cursing her and trying to push her to kill him. And she decides, no, walks away from him. And she's asked by Mordred, why didn't you kill him? Because that's what he wanted me to do. It's far crueler if I let him live. And I think that's also kind of Morgoth's mindset with Hurin.
That was Martin Short's character, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
And
it's been a long time since I saw that, but I remember parts of it.
I see it. I watch it every year because I love Arthuriana and I love that story. I love that. It's my favorite adaptation of Arthuriana. So, but yeah, I think that there was a certain amount of cruelty in letting Hurin live on Morgoth's part as well. But because almost everything he does is cruel. He'd kick puppies if he could.
Yeah. If he had the option.
Sorry. Yeah, there's always the option. Oh, I didn't even notice Ryan Milky because I had maxed out the screen here. Found myself a little while to hang out and learn under the Kryn weirwood tree. Weirwood tree, that's a Martin reference, isn't it? I always forget.
I do not know what that means.
I think Game of Thrones, I think. I'm guessing. I heard it a while back. I'm doing some videos on it, but I never retain anything. I just read it, make a note.
After a while, there's only so much your brain can just hold.
Yeah, I don't try to remember it. And everything's well. Ryan Milky 14. I don't try to remember it because I'd rather try to remember Howard or Tolkien or classic lit, because that's the stuff I really, really like.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it also means that I often forget things like taking the dog out for a run and my mother's birthday. So priorities.
Right?
I have my priorities straight.
Yeah.
Well,
Speaking of priorities, I hear screaming children in the background. I
all right. That's
think
our
I
cue.
probably need to go.
Yep, that's our cue. I heard them. That's the cue to leave. So I hope everyone enjoyed this stream. I don't know if I put your link in the description, but if I didn't, I'm going to put it in the comments section and I'm going to pin that, because I'm pretty sure everybody who's watched this stream are probably more your fans. But if there's any fans that I've got from maybe the Conan or Dragonlance fan base, I'd really want to redirect them to your channel, because your channel, alongside Girl Next Gondor, are two of the best Tolkien channels out there and are two of the most educational about the literature and the life of Tolkien and where he was really coming from. At least I rank you as one of the probably top 4 channels, probably tied up to top 3.
I appreciate that. That's that's nice to hear.
Oh, it's the truth as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not trying to flatter. I'm just saying I listen to your and Girl Next Gondor's stuff and even your streams while I'm doing other things, because I feel smarter listening to you. So, which isn't saying much about me, but the thing is, so everybody go over to TolkienLore, smash that subscribe. I don't know if you've hit 20,000 yet, but let's try to.
Getting close, but not quite.
I really want you to get there. So, like I said, I'm a fan of yours, so I want you to get there. And if anyone's not yet subscribed to this channel, do try to subscribe. I don't quite measure up to TolkienLore or Girl Next Gondor, but I try, and I face plant like Turin Turambar while doing it. So,
well, you're also covering a wider variety of stuff. Like I do Tolkien because that's like literally all I know. So
it's okay.
I know it really well because I don't know anything else.
Okay. Well, it's like Musashi Miyamoto said, you practice the same sword swing 1,000 times, you become the master of that sword swing. Better than anyone else ever could be. And that's the way to mastery.
Yep.
Oh, and Solomon Fire, I don't know this person. Thank you so much. It was a great stream. Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to stick all the blame for the great stream on TolkienLore. Anyways, you got to go. And everybody, do take care. Wish everyone the very best. I believe you tend to say Namarie, right?
Namarie. That's right.
Yeah.